This is a video tutorial of the second Aliyah for the first triennial cycle of Parashat Kedoshim, corresponding to Leviticus chapter 19, verses 5 through 10. This tutorial has 5 steps. The first step will simply be practicing the Hebrew, in which we will break down each particular verse into its different parts, and then practice the whole verse by themselves. And then the second part of this first step is that as we go through the verses, we will be combining learning the verses together. So for instance, after we learn verse 5 and then verse 6 independently, we will read 5 and 6 together, then learn verse 7 on itself, then read 5, 6, and 7, and so on and so forth until we read the entire Torah portion together. And that way you have a sense as to how the words flow together as one whole part. The second step, that's actually this, then the second step, the second or third, or you can say actually this is the third step, is to be doing the same thing when it comes to practicing the part on the Torah side, in which there are no vowels and there are no trut marks. And again, we will break down the verses into its different selections, followed by reading them as the verses by themselves. And then every time we learn one verse, we will also add the previous verses together so that you can hear what it looks like as one particular part. Then the final step will be in which you will have a version of the Torah reading as it appears in the actual Torah from which you will be reading during the service, in order to see what it looks like from the actual Torah and to practice it from the Torah. One other point to make before we begin is that as we go through the learning, I will be saying pause when you should pause the video and practice what we just learned to yourself by singing it out loud. So for instance, after I say the words V'chi tizbechu, I will say pause, and then you should take that time to pause the video and to practice the words V'chi tizbechu. Once you have practiced them thoroughly, you can unpause the video and it will pick up with the next phrase. And that will be the pattern throughout the entire practice. And without further ado, we will begin with the first step of just learning the breakdown of the verses. Beginning with chapter 19, verse 5. V'chi tizbechu. Pause and learn on your own. Continuing. Zevach shlamim ladonai. Pause. Continuing. Lirtzonechem tizbachuhu. Pause. Now we'll read all of verse 5 together. V'chi tizbechu zevach shlamim ladonai lirtzonechem tizbachuhu. Pause and practice that verse in its entirety. Now we'll continue on to verse 6, breaking it down into its different sections. Beyom zivchachem. Pause. Continuing. Ye'achel umimochorat. Pause. Continuing. Vehanotar ad yom hashlishi. Pause. Continuing. ba'esh yisaref. Pause. Now read verse 6 all together. Beyom zivchachem ye'achel umimochorat v'hanotar ad yom hashlishi ba'esh yisaref. Pause. Now read verse 5 and verse 6 together. V'chi tizbechu zevach shlamim ladonai lirtzonechem tizbachuhu beyom zivchachem ye'achel umimochorat v'hanotar ad yom hashlishi ba'esh yisaref. Pause. Now we're going to practice verse 7 in its selections. Ve'im. Pause. Continuing. He'achol ye'achel bayom hashlishi. Pause. Continuing. Pigul hu lo yeratzeh. Pause. Now all of verse 7 together. Ve'im he'achol ye'achel bayom hashlishi pigul hu lo yeratzeh. Pause. Now read verses 5, 6, and 7 all together. V'chi tizbechu zevach shlamim ladonai lirtzonechem tizbachuhu beyom zivchachem ye'achel umimochorat v'hanotar ad yom hashlishi ba'esh yisaref. Ve'im he'achol ye'achel bayom hashlishi pigul hu lo yeratzeh. Pause. Now, verse 8 broken down into its specific parts. Ve'ochlav avono yisa. Pause. Ki et kodesh Adonai chilel. Pause. Continuing. Ve'nichreta. Pause. Continuing. Hanefesh hahi me'ameha. Pause. Now verse 8 in its entirety. Ve'ochlav avono yisa. Ki et kodesh Adonai chilel. Ve'nichreta hanefesh hahi me'ameha. Pause. Now verses 5 through 8 in their entirety. V'chi tizbechu zevach shlamim ladonai lirtzonechem tizbachuhu beyom zivchachem ye'achel umimochorat v'hanotar ad yom hashlishi ba'esh yisaref. Ve'im he'achol ye'achel bayom hashlishi pigul hu lo yeratzeh. Ve'ochlav avono yisa. Ki et kodesh Adonai chilel. Ve'nichreta hanefesh hahi me'ameha. Pause. Now verse 9, broken up into its different parts. Uvkutzrechem et kitzir artzechem. Pause. Continuing. Lo techale. Pause. Continuing. Pe'at sadecha liktzor. Pause. Veleket ketzircha lo telaket. Pause. Now verse 9 in its entirety. Uvkutzrechem et ketzir artzechem. Lo techale pe'at sadecha liktzor. Veleket ketzircha lo telaket. Pause. Now verses 5 through 9 in its entirety. Vechi tizbechu zevach shlamim ladonai. Lirtzonchem tizbachuhu. Beyom zivchachem ye'achel umimochorat. Vehanotar ad yom hashlishi ba'esh yisaref. Ve'im he'achol ye'achel bayom hashlishi. Pigul hu lo yeratzeh. Ve'ochlav avono yisa. Ki et kodesh Adonai chilel. Ve'nichreta hanefesh hahi me'ameha. Uvkutzrechem et ketzir artzechem. Lo techale pe'at sadecha liktzor. Veleket ketzircha lo telaket. Pause. Now verse 10, broken up into its different selections. Vecharmecha lo te'olel. Pause. Continuing. Uferet karmecha lo telaket. Pause. Continuing. Le'ani velager ta'azov otam. Pause. Ani, continuing. Ani Adonai Elohechem. Pause. Now all of verse 10 together. Vecharmecha lo te'olel. Uferet karmecha lo telaket. Le'ani velager ta'azov otam. Ani Adonai Elohechem. Pause. Now we're going to read the entire Torah portion together from verse 5 through verse 10. And when I pause, you're going to have to probably back up a little bit in order to practice all the words since they can't all appear on one page on the screen. Beginning with verse 5. Vechi tizbechu zevach shlamim ladonai lirtzonechem tizbachuhu. Beyom zivchachem ye'achel umimochorat. Vehanotar ad yom hashlishi ba'esh yisaref. Ve'im he'achol ye'achel bayom hashlishi pigul hu lo yeratzeh. Ve'ochlav avono yisa, ki et kodesh Adonai chilel. Ve'nichreta hanefesh hahi me'ameha. Uvkutzrechem et ketzir artzechem. Lo techale pe'at sadecha liktzor. Veleket ketzircha lo telaket. Vecharmecha lo teolel. Uferet karmecha lo telaket. Le'ani velager ta'azov otam. Ani Adonai Elohechem. Pause. So now I remember why I got a little bit confused in terms of number of steps. We're now moving to step 2, which is to transfer simply the reading of the Hebrew to the Torah side for you to get a sense as to what the words look like, because the most important part of the reading is the words, not necessarily the trup, although the trup is important. The most important part are the words. And so that's why we're focusing on them on the first 2 steps. And so we'll begin with verse 5 again in the same manner as on the other side by breaking them down into their different parts, reading each verse, and then reading the previous verses along with it together. And so we begin with verse 5. Vechi tizbechu. Pause. Continuing. Zevach shlamim ladonai. Pause. Continuing. Lirtzonechem tizbachuhu. Pause. Continuing. Now with the entire verse 5. Now from the entire verse 5. Vechi tizbechu zevach shlamim ladonai. Lirtzonechem tizbachuhu. Pause. Now verse 6, broken into its different parts. Gotta check one thing. Beyom zivchachem. Pause. Ye'achel umimochorat. Pause. Continuing. Vehanotar ad yom hashlishi. Pause. Continuing. Ba'esh yisaref. Pause. Now all of verse 6 together. Beyom zivchachem ye'achel umimochorat. Vehanotar ad yom hashlishi ba'esh yisaref. Pause. Now verses 5 and 6 together. Vechi tizbechu zevach shlamim ladonai. Lirtzonechem tizbachuhu. Beyom zivchachem ye'achel umimochorat. Vehanotar ad yom hashlishi ba'esh yisaref. Pause. Now continuing with verse 7, broken down into its different parts. Ve'im. Pause. Continuing. He'achol ye'achel bayom hashlishi. Pause. Continuing. Pigul hu lo yeratzeh. Pause. Now all of verse 7 together. Ve'im he'achol ye'achel bayom hashlishi pigul hu lo yeratzeh. Pause. Now verses 5 through 7 together. V'chi tizbechu zevach shlamim ladonai lirtzonechem tizbachuhu. Beyom zivchachem ye'achel umimochorat. V'hanotar ad yom hashlishi ba'esh yisaref. Ve'im he'achol ye'achel bayom hashlishi pigul hu lo yeratzeh. Pause. Now verse 8, broken into its different parts. Ve'ochlav avono yisa. Pause. Continuing. Ki et kodesh Adonai chilel. Pause. Continuing. Venichreta. Pause. Hanefesh hahi me'ameha. Pause. Now all of verse 8 together. Ve'ochlav avono yisa. Ki et kodesh Adonai chilel. Venichreta hanefesh hahi me'ameha. Pause. Now verses 5 through 8. V'chi tizbechu zevach shlamim ladonai lirtzonechem tizbachuhu. Beyom zivchachem ye'achel umimochorat. V'hanotar ad yom hashlishi ba'esh yisaref. Ve'im he'achol ye'achel bayom hashlishi pigul hu lo yeratzeh. Ve'ochlav avono yisa. Ki et kodesh Adonai chilel. Venichreta hanefesh hahi me'ameha. Pause. Now verse 9, broken into its different parts. Uvkutzrechem et ketzir artzechem. Pause. Continuing. Lo techale. Pause. Continuing. Pe'at sadecha liktzor. Pause. Veleket ketzircha lo telaket. Pause. Now all of verse 9 together. Uvkutzrechem et ketzir artzechem. Lo techale. Pe'at sadecha liktzor. Veleket ketzircha lo telaket. Pause. Now verses 5 through 9 together. V'chi tizbechu zevach shlamim ladonai lirtzonechem tizbachuhu. Beyom zivchachem ye'achel umimochorat. V'hanotar ad yom hashlishi ba'esh yisaref. Ve'im He'achol ye'achel bayom hashlishi. Pigul hu lo yeratzeh. Ve'ochlav avono yisa. Ki et kodesh Adonai chilel. Ve'nichreta hanefesh hahi me'ameha. Uvkutzrechem et ketzir artzechem. Lo techale pe'at sadecha liktzor. Veleket ketzircha lo telaket. Pause. Now, moving to verse 10, broken into its different parts. Vecharmecha lo te'olel. Pause. Continuing. Uferet karmecha lo telaket. Pause. Continuing. Le'ani velager ta'azov otam. Pause. Ani, continuing. Ani Adonai Elohechem. Pause. Now verse 10 in its entirety. Vecharmecha lo te'olel. Uferet karmecha lo telaket. Le'ani velager ta'azov otam. Ani Adonai Elohechem. Pause. Now we're going to read the entire Torah portion from verses 5 through 10. And as mentioned before, that you'll probably have to, when I pause it, you'll probably have to back up the video a little bit in order to get to this first section, since the last line is on a different page. Beginning with verse 5. Vechi tizbechu zevach shlamim ladonai, lirtzonechem tizbachuhu. Beyom zivchachem ye'achel umimochorat, vehanotar ad yom hashlishi ba'esh yisaref. Ve'im he'achol ye'achel bayom hashlishi, pigul hu lo yeratzeh. Ve'ochlav avono yisa, ki et kodesh Adonai chilel. Ve'nichreta hanefesh hahi me'ameha. Uvkutzrechem et ketzir artzechem. Lo techale pe'at sadecha liktzor. Veleket ketzircha lo telaket. Vecharmecha lo te'olel. Uferet karmecha lo telaket. Le'ani velager ta'azov otam. Ani Adonai Elohechem. Pause. Step 3 is learning how to sing the trup with the words on the vowel side. We'll be doing this just like the first step, in which we break up each particular verse into different sections and then put the whole verse together and then add all the previous verses in as a whole until we complete the entire part together. You might have noticed that from the very first step and also the second step that we broke them up according to particular sections. those sections are actually dependent upon the trup, because not all trup is the same. The trup form phrases within the context of the reading, and so the particular selections were divided according to the flow of the trup. So for instance, in verse 7, that the one phrase was ve'im, and then I paused, because the trup here, which is known as a tivir, is its own independent trup, and then the next phrase begins he'achol ye'achel bayom hashlishi, which is one whole trup phrase in and of themselves. Although we will not be learning how to read Torah in other parts other than just here, I'd like you to just pay attention to the marks up here on the bottom of the words, such as this backward Z, or this little dot and then sort of a curved line, the curved line, and then the opposite curved line, then the wishbone here, as these are the trup marks both below and above the line, as you see here at the end of the resh. And just to pay attention when certain trup marks repeat, as the first two in verse 5 do with the same as verse 6, and just to kind of hear how they're the same. And so maybe through osmosis, you'll learn a little bit of what these different trup marks sound like. But without further ado, we'll begin with step 3 in verse 5. Verse 5, this is the second Aliyah, and we'll begin with the trup. Vechi tizbechu. Pause. Continue. Zevach shelamim ladonai. Pause. Lirtzonechem tizbachu. Pause. Now all of verse 5 together. Vechi tizbechu. Zevach shelamim ladonai. Lirtzonechem tizbachu. Pause. Verse 6 divided into different sections. Beyom zivchachem. Pause. Continue. Ye'achel umimochorat. Pause. Continue. Vehanotar ad yom hashlishi. Pause. Continue. Ba'esh yisaref. Pause. Now verse 6 in its entirety. Beyom zivchachem ye'achel umimochorat vehanotar ad yom hashlishi ba'esh yisaref. Pause. Now verses 5 and 6 together. Vechi tizbechu zevach shelamim ladonai. Lirtzonechem tizbachu beyom zivchachem ye'achel umimochorat vehanotar ad yom hashlishi ba'esh yisaref. Pause. Now verse 7 divided into parts. Ve'im. Pause. Continue. He'achol ye'achel bayom hashlishi. Pause. Continue. Pigul hu lo yeratzeh. Pause. Now verse 7 in its entirety. Ve'im he'achol ye'achel bayom hashlishi pigul hu lo yeratzeh. Pause. Now verses 5 through 7 together. Vechi tizbechu zevach shalamim ladonai lirtzonechem tizbechu beyom zivchachem yeachel umimochorat vehanotar ad yom hashalishi ba'esh yisaref ve'im he'achol ye'achel bayom hashalishi pigul hu lo yeratzeh. Pause. Verse 8 broken into parts. Ve'ochelav avono yisa. Pause. Continue. Ki et kodesh Adonai chilel. Pause. Continue. Venichreta. Pause. Continue. Ha-nefesh ha-hi me'ameha. Pause. Now verse 8 in its entirety. Ve'ochlav avono yisa ki et kodesh Adonai chilel venichreta ha-nefesh ha-hi me'ameha. Pause. Verses 5 through 8 in their entirety. Vechi tizbechu zevach shalamim ladonai lirtzonechem tizbechu beyom zivchachem ye'achel umimochorat vehanotar ad yom hashalishi ba'esh yisaref ve'im he'achol ye'achel bayom hashalishi pigul hu lo yeratzeh ve'ochlav avono yisa ki et kodesh Adonai chilel venichreta ha-nefesh ha-hi me'ameha. Pause. Now verse 9 broken into parts. Uvkutzrechem et ketzir artzechem. Pause. Continue. Lo techale. Pause. Continue. Pe'at sadecha liktzor. Pause. Continue. Veleket ketzircha lo telaket. Pause. Now verse 9 in its entirety. Uvkutzrechem et ketzir artzechem lo techale pe'at sadecha liktzor veleket ketzircha lo telaket. Pause. Now verses 5 through 8 together. Vechi tizbechu zevach shalamim ladonai lirtzonechem tizbechu beyom zivchachem ye'achel umimochorat vehanotar ad yom השלישי באש ישרף. ואם האכול יאכל ביום השלישי, פיגול הוא לא ירצה, ואוכליו עוונו יישא, כי את קודש אדוני חילל, ונכרתה הנפש ההיא מעמיה. ובקוצריכם את קציר ארצכם לא תכלה, פאת שדך לקצור, ולקט קצירך לא תלקט. Pause. Now verse 10 broken into parts. וחרמך לא תעולל. Pause. Continue. ופרת כרמך לא תלקט. Pause. Continue. לעני ולגר תעזוב אותם. Pause. Continue. אני אדוני אלוהיכם. Pause. Now verse 10 in its entirety. וכרמך לא תעולל, ופרת כרמך לא תלקט, לעני ולגר תעזוב אותם, אני אדוני אלוהיכם. Pause. And just to review, that the first time I went through this, I actually said the final phrase incorrectly because this is the final phrase of the entire Torah reading, and as such it has a very special trup to allow the congregation to join in. So just to review quickly, the phrase is Ani Adonai Elohechem. Pause to sing just that. Now we're going to do the entire Torah reading, beginning from verse 5 through verse 10. And then after we get to the end, you will probably have to rewind just a little bit on your screen in order to look at this first section, because we're going to end on this final verse, which is on a different page and doesn't appear on the screen with the other section. So we're going to now begin with verse 5 for the entire Torah reading. Vechi tizbechu zevach shalamim ladonai lirtzonechem tizbechu beyom zivchachem yeachel umimochorat vehanotar ad yom hashlishi ba'esh yisaref. ואם האכול יאכל ביום השלישי, פיגול הוא לא ירצה, ואוכליו עוונו יישא, כי את קודש אדוני חילל, ונכרתה הנפש ההיא מעמיה. ובקוצריכם את קציר ארצכם לא תכלה, פאת שדך לקצור, ולקט קצירך לא תלקט. וכרמך לא תעולל, ופרת כרמך לא תלקט, לעני ולגר תעזוב אותם, Ani Adonai Elohechem. Pause. Step 4. Reading with the trup on the Torah side with no vowels and no trup marks. We'll begin with verse 5, and as has been the program so far, we'll break up each verse and then do each verse in its entirety. And as we continue to go through, we'll read each verse along with the previous ones until we conclude with the final verse. And so we begin with chapter 19, verse 5. V'chi tizbechu. Pause. Continue. Zevach shalamim ladonai. Pause. Continue. Lirtzonechem tizbachuhu. Pause. Verse 5 now in its entirety. V'chi tizbechu zevach shalamim ladonai lirtzonechem tizbachuhu. Pause. Verse 6 divided into parts. Beyom zivchachem ye'achel umimochorat. Pause. Continue. V'hanotar ad yom hashlishi. Pause. Continue. Ba'esh yisaref. Pause. Now verse 6 in its entirety. Beyom zivchachem ye'achel umimochorat v'hanotar ad yom hashlishi ba'esh yisaref. Pause. Now verse 5 and 6 together. V'chi tizbechu zevach shalamim ladonai lirtzonechem tizbachuhu beyom zivchachem ye'achel umimochorat v'hanotar ad yom hashlishi ba'esh yisaref. Pause. Now verse 7 divided into parts. Ve'im. Pause. Continue. He'achol ye'achel bayom hashlishi. Pause. Continue. Pigul hu lo yeratzeh. Pause. Now verse 7 in its entirety. Ve'im he'achol ye'achel bayom hashlishi pigul hu lo yeratzeh. Pause. Now verses 5, 6, and 7 together. V'chi tizbechu zevach shalamim ladonai lirtzonechem tizbachuhu beyom zivchachem ye'achel umimochorat v'hanotar ad yom hashlishi ba'esh yisaref ve'im he'achol ye'achel bayom hashlishi pigul hu lo yeratzeh. Pause. Now verse 8 divided into parts. Ve'ochalav avono yisa. Pause. Continue. Ki et kodesh Adonai chilel. Pause. Continue. Venichreta. Pause. Continue. Hanefesh hahi me'ameha. Pause. Now verse 8 in its entirety. Ve'ochlav avono yisa, ki et kodesh Adonai chilel, venichreta hanefesh hahi me'ameha. Pause. Now we continue from verse 5 all the way through 8 together. Vechi tizbechu zevach shalamim ladonai lirtzonechem tizbachuhu beyom zivchachem ye'achel umimochorat v'hanotar ad yom hashalishi ba'esh yisaref ve'im he'achol ye'achel bayom hashlishi pigul hu lo yeratzeh ve'ochlav avono yisa ki et kodesh Adonai chilel venichreta hanefesh hahi me'ameha. Pause. Now verse 9 divided into parts. Uvkutzrechem et ketzir artzechem. Pause. Continue. Lo techale. Pause. Continue. Pe'at sadecha liktzor. Pause. Continue. Veleket ketzircha lo telaket. Pause. Now verse 9 together. Now verse 9 in its entirety. Uvkutzrechem et ketzir artzechem lo techale pe'at sadecha liktzor veleket ketzircha lo telaket. Pause. Now verses 5 through 9 together. Vechi tizbechu zevach shalamim ladonai lirtzonechem tizbachuhu beyom zivchachem ye'achel umimochorat v'hanotar ad yom hashlishi ba'esh yisaref ve'im he'achol ye'achel bayom hashlishi pigul hu lo yeratzeh ve'ochlav avono yisa ki et kodesh Adonai chilel venichreta hanefesh hahi me'ameha. Uvkutzrechem et ketzir artzechem lo techale pe'at sadecha liktzor veleket ketzircha lo telaket. Pause. Now verse 10 divided into parts. Vecharmecha lo te'olel. Pause. Continue. Uferet karmecha lo telaket. Pause. Continue. Le'ani velager ta'azov otam. Pause. Continue. Ani Adonai Elohechem. Pause. Now verse 10 in its entirety. Vecharmecha lo te'olel, uferet karmecha lo telaket, le'ani velager ta'azov otam, ani Adonai Elohechem. Pause. Now we'll be reading the entire Aliyah, verses 5 through 10. And when we get to the end, you may want to rewind in order to see this first section, because the last line appears on a different page. But now beginning with verse 5. V'chi tizbechu zevach shalamim ladonai lirtzonechem tizbachu beyom zivchachem ye'achel umimochorat v'hanotar ad yom hashlishi ba'esh yisaref ve'im He'achol ye'achel bayom hashlishi pigul hu lo yeratzeh ve'ochlav avono yisa ki et kodesh Adonai chilel ve'nichreta hanefesh hahi me'ameha uvkutzrechem et ketzir artzechem lo techale pe'at sadecha liktzor veleket ketzircha lo telaket vecharmecha lo te'olel uferet karmecha lo telaket le'ani velager ta'azov otam ani Adonai Elohechem. Pause. Now that you've completed step 4, we move on to step 5, where you'll be able to see what the reading will look like from the actual Torah that will be used on the day of the reading.
The second Aliyah of Parashat Kedoshim, according to the first triennial cycle, Leviticus chapter 19, verses 5 through 10. V'chi tizbechu zevach shlamim ladonai lirtzonechem tizbachu beyom zivchachem ye'achel umimochorat v'hanotar ad yom hashlishi ba'esh yisaref ve'im He'achol ye'achel bayom hashlishi pigul hu lo yeratzeh ve'ochlav avono yisa ki et kodesh Adonai chilel ve'nichreta hanefesh hahi me'ameha uvkutzrechem et ketzir artzechem Lo techale pe'at sadecha liktzor veleket ketzircha lo telaket vecharmecha lo te'olel, uferet karmecha lo telaket, le'ani velager ta'azov otam, ani Adonai Elohechem.